So, have you ever heard something in a sermon or a video and you just go, huh, I've never heard that before? Well, I had that happen recently whenever I saw this.
Assyria worshipped many gods. One of them was called Oannes. Do you want to know what Oannes looks like? He's a river god, and the emblem of Oannes is a man emerging out of a
Okay.
fish.
So, I know a decent amount about the book of Jonah, but I've never heard that before. And, one of the things you do as a seminarian is you translate the entire book of Jonah. I've never seen that, heard that referenced, anything like that. And beyond that, the kind of the most disturbing thing about this particular little Instagram short is that the image that's used there is actually not an image of the god Dagon, as is purported. It's actually an image of the god Vishnu, which is a Indian deity, so doesn't really apply here. And so you can imagine my suspicion. But as I went on and as I started to dig into this, I was like, this journey is absolutely fascinating, and coming to the conclusion that this isn't really true, but the journey to getting there is absolutely fascinating. And so I'm really excited to go along and go on this with you. So let's get into it. So, of course, like any rational human would do, the first thing I did was just Google Jonah and Oannes. I've never heard of it before. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so I came up upon a website that had an article about this particular topic. I believe it's an Eastern Orthodox perspective, but within it, what I found is a quotation by a theologian named H. Clay Trumbull. And so he talks about these various claims, the word Oannes, the connection with Jonah, and it was really interesting. And so I decided to use that as kind of a stepping off point for a discussion of this topic. I don't want to just dismiss it out of hand. I do want to give it a hearing, because 9 times out of 10, the journey to finding what the truth is more interesting than the truth itself. So I dug into this article. Before I actually got into that, I looked into the man himself and I was like, wow, this dude is fascinating. Henry Clay Trumbull was born in Connecticut in, I believe, 1830. He served as an army chaplain in the Civil War. He was taken captive. He was educated only really up to the age of 14, but he wrote 38 books and was elected to the American Philosophical Society, as well as serving as the Lyman Beecher Lecturer at Yale Divinity School. So you kind of have this dichotomy of a guy who's lived a really rich and interesting life, but maybe by modern standards wasn't very educated. He was obviously an intelligent guy, obviously, knew a lot, and was very intelligent, but, maybe didn't match up to what we would expect. But super fascinating dude. I would love to actually read a couple of his books and go further in that. But let's get into the actual article itself. That's what we're here for. So Trumbull's article ultimately is a defense or an argument for the historicity of Jonah. And that's perfectly okay, right? I'd probably be somewhere in that boat myself. And but he goes on and he talks about, he sort of contextualizes the miracles of the Bible and talks about how they are sort of like almost more believable. And so, for instance, they're not pointless. So the 10 plagues in Egypt were striking against various different gods in Egypt. And Moses, whenever the children of Israel went across the Red Sea, he didn't just like teleport them across the Red Sea. He split the Red Sea and they went across it then, right? So there's this sort of logicality, if that's a word, to the miracles of the Bible. And that's part of his argumentation. And he goes in and talks some more about this god Dagan. Okay, so that this god Dagan was foundational to the Ninevites and the Mesopotamian religion. And there was a half fish, half man god. And for this information, he actually quotes from Berossus. And Berossus is another guy I hadn't heard of. So I was really super excited to, find out who that was. So Berossus was an early 3rd century BCE Hellenistic writer. We don't have his original writings, but they survive in the writings of Eusebius, some hundreds of years later. And so the time between Eusebius writing and Berossus writing, I believe, is about 600 years. And then you kind of have another, I don't know, several hundred years from the time that Berossus actually wrote to the events that he describes. Okay. So what did he actually write? Berossus writes as follows. So this is the history which Berossus has transmitted to us. He tells us that the first king was Alorus of Babylon, a Chaldean. He reigned 10 sari, or I believe that's years, 10 years. And afterward, Alparis and Amilon, who came from Pantabiblion. Then Amemnon, the Chaldean, in whose time appeared the Musaris Oannes. Okay, there's our word. The Amadotus from the Erythraean Sea. Berossus, goes on to point out that there are many other instances of this sort of fish god character thing coming out of the Erythraean Sea, which I believe is the Red Sea, by the way. And then he continues on by writing this. They're related particularly and circumstantially whatever Oannes had informed them of. So it's also kind of important to note here that all of this takes place before the Great Flood in their flood narrative, in their creation narrative. And the kings listed here, their reigns equal up to about 120 years. Okay. And so this is sort of their Genesis, and that's not to say that Genesis preceded it or whatever. It's just same culture, same types of stories. This is kind of their Genesis account. And so what it comes down to, and Trumbull's conclusion that he makes off of this, is he says something along the lines of, isn't it reasonable to think that Berossus, writing sometime later, would have interpolated or put in the name of Jonah, because the name Oannes is basically the Greek version of the Hebrew name Jonah or Yonah. So the Y in Greek turns into a J, just like, Jesus, for instance, Jonathan. So, excuse me, not Jonathan, it's Yeshua, right? Yeshua, Jesus, or, John, those types of names, they're actually Y fronted names in Hebrew, but they take a J in Greek. And so same thing here. So Jonah, Ioannes. So he's saying that he's kind of put that name in there because he's familiar with the Jonah story. And so we actually have a pretty good date for when Jonah would have ministered. He prophesied during the time of Jeroboam II. That's recorded in 1 Kings 14:32. Where it talks about his prophecy there. This was actually a time of Nineveh and Assyria's sort of downfall and decline in power. So it would sort of make sense in that he would have been prophesying their destruction during that time as well. So it kind of all lines up. And the actual dating for Jonah's prophecy is around 786 to 746 BCE. Had to glance at my notes there. So, we have a pretty good idea of when he was prophesying. So if we go back to when Berossus would have been writing, we're looking at, a couple hundred to, 300-400 years between Berossus and Jonah himself. And so what Trumbull is saying is that he knew about Jonah when he was writing his myth and then put that name in there because he knew of that. So now back to the Trumbull article, his sort of last argumentation is around this site called Nebi Yunus, as how he puts it. Now, if you happen to watch my episode on what is a prophet, you'll remember that the primary word for prophet is Navi in Hebrew. And so this is Arabic. And so in Arabic, it's Nebi. So Nebi Yunus is the prophet Jonah. So there's a site in modern day Mosul, Iraq, known as Nebi Yunus. There's a mosque there that was unfortunately destroyed in the the early 2000s by ISIS that was dedicated to the prophet Jonah. So it's an Islamic mosque. And so he talks about that and uses that as some evidence as well for, Jonah being associated with Nineveh. Now, I'm not really arguing that. I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you believe the Bible, that he's associated with Nineveh, but it's always pretty cool to have corroborating evidence and other sources that back up what the text says. So just to summarize, we have the early inclusion of Dagon's name in early kings lists from Trumbull's article. Then we have the inclusion of the word Oannes by Berossus in creation myths, or Mesopotamian creation myths. And then we have this site Nebi Yunus. So these are kind of the 3 points of argument that Trumbull will use to conclude that this is, in fact, valid, to associate Oannes with this half-man, half-fish god. So these Dagon names do indeed occur in the early kings lists. I mean, you can look that up. But what it really comes down to then, where the argument honestly kind of falls apart, is that Dagon is not actually associated with a half-fish, half-man god at all. In fact, the word Dagon, so the name Dagon, for some time was associated with fish, because the Hebrew word for fish is dag. Okay. And you can see that there's a similarity there. There's the same letters, the same vowel pointings and things like that. However, that's just not the case. They're not related. It's also been associated with fertility and harvest, because Dagon was a fertility deity, and the word for grain is Dagan. So that is actually valid, in that probably more likely the name for grain, or the word for grain, came from the name Dagon rather than the other way around. So he is associated with fertility. He's a major god for the Amorites, and often the prophets would receive ecstatic prophetic utterances in the temple of Dagon and then would take those to the king. So it's pretty interesting, and there's a lot of context there. It's also the chief god of the Philistines, which we're probably pretty familiar with, the instance where the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines and taken to the temple of Dagon, and there fell down before it. Okay, and so it fell down before it, and then its hands were chopped off and its head was chopped off, and it lay there in the threshold. And so they actually, interestingly enough, those thresholds sort of hold some spiritual significance, and that they felt that different spirits kind of resided in the threshold, and so that's why they end up not stepping on the threshold. So we do have Dagon described in the Old Testament once there. They don't mention anything about fins. The only really thing that they say is that after his hands and his head were cut off, that only his trunk remained, or only his pedestal remained, you could even say. So we have that occurrence there, no real reference to fish or anything like that. And so ultimately, the connection between Dagon and Dag, or fish, is what the Dictionary of Deities and Demons of the Old Testament describes as folk etymology. And so, unfortunately, what that means is pretty much someone saying that one word is related to another word because it sounds like that word. And so there's instances in modern day where this happens, where people think that the king of Rosh in Ezekiel 38:2 is related to Russia because it sounds like the word Russia. And that's just false. So it still happens. Folk etymology is a real thing. Folk archaeology, I think, is a real thing. We see that often where people say that, oh, hey, this looks like a pyramid, therefore it must be a pyramid, whatever. So it happened back then, it happens now. So it shouldn't really be all that surprising to us. And so now we move on to Berossus' inclusion of Oannes in his writings. And so ultimately, this too kind of falls flat, is that yes, there was this god that came out of the water and sort of brought knowledge and civilization to the ancient Mesopotamians, but Oannes is not related to Jonah. In fact, Eugene Merrill, who wrote an article on this particular topic in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society, has this to say. He says, and I quote, "It may be tempting to see a linguistic connection between the Greek Oannes and Hebrew Jonah. More likely, one should compare with the Sumerian Uana or something similar to that." Merrill also goes on to point out that the connection with fish, so that we just kind of discussed with Dagan, is probably more likely in relation to Nineveh's name rather than any purported connection with Dagan, because the name Nineveh sort of means fish town. So you have the goddess Ninua, who is a fish goddess, and then you have the word Nunu, which is the word for fish, and then you have Nineveh. So he says that's the more likely connection there. So, hey, could be. And so on to Nebi Yunus, or the prophet Jonah, the shrine there. This is a place that exists. I mean, there's pictures of it. There's pictures of it before it was destroyed, after it was destroyed. There's drawings of it that you can find from archaeological records, but it was a known site. It wasn't necessarily just, discovered by archaeologists. In fact, Trumbull kind of intimates that the knowledge of this particular site is almost miraculous, given that it was quote unquote forgotten by history up until the point where it was rediscovered. And so it kind of gives us a little hint of his maybe biases that he's looking at there. And to be frank, this site wasn't discovered until, I believe it was the mid 1800s. And so that, that's right around the time of Henry Clay Trumbull. So, it's kind of a new discovery and interesting. But the Anchor Bible Dictionary actually has this to say about kind of this thought process. I thought it was interesting, so I wanted to share it with you. So Anchor Bible Dictionary says, and I quote, "Although the ancient location of Nineveh was never forgotten in native tradition, European explorers who were ignorant of this tradition remained confused about the location until the mid-19th century." So until the mid-19th century, they remained confused because they didn't sort of take the native tradition at its word, right? So sort of similar concept, maybe there wasn't as much trust in sort of indigenous accounts as we might have today. And so, yeah, so Nebi Yunus was a real place. It is a real place. It is actually the site of Nineveh in Mosul, Iraq. So, hey, straight up, that's pretty cool. So what do we actually conclude? The connection between Jonah and Dagan, there's just no evidence. The connection between Dagan and this fish god, also no evidence, right? There's connection between Jonah and Oannes is linguistically tempting, but ultimately false. So the only real primary historical piece of data here is the location of Mosul, Iraq as Nineveh, which is fascinating, but doesn't really help move this argument along. So why then does it show up in sermons and Instagram clips and things like that? Well, because it's compelling. But unfortunately, compelling doesn't always equal credible. So both Trumbull and modern preachers have this in common. They have a focus on proclamation. They want to make the text interesting. They want to make it applicable. They want to bring a change in people's lives, and that ultimately can become the litmus test for whether something gets included or not. But sometimes a point is so good homiletically that it survives long after the scholarship has moved on. And that's why we test everything and hold fast to what is true, even the things that sound amazing. So if you've heard this line of argumentation before, let me know. I'm interested. I'm curious. I've seen it a few different places myself in my research, and it's a little concerning. So if you're interested in more content like this with different deep dives on various topics that are maybe in the popular imagination, I would love to do it. I've enjoyed doing this. Let me know in the comments.